Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Cokerhook. This evening, we're going to have, I think we're going to have a really interesting and fun conversation. Joining me this evening is Mr. Glen Merzer, who has a fascinating background in script writing and book writing and whatnot, and film and all that sort of thing. But today, we're going to talk about a couple of books that he's written. One is called Own Your Health. I don't know if you can see that one all right. And the other one is called Food is Climate. And we're going to be talking to Glen about this today and getting some input and feedback from him. So Glen, hi, welcome to Reference Point.
Hi, Dave. Good to be here with you.
Very much appreciate your joining us this evening. So you are currently located in Indiana, is that right?
Indiana.
Indiana,
Yes.
Very cool. So I wanted to get a little bit of your background. I want to talk about these two books specifically and what they mean relative to a variety of things: health, economics, ecology, climatology and stuff like that. But it would be helpful for people to get a little bit of your background. So tell us a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind.
Well, I grew up on Long Island in a middle-class home and went to college in Florida. And after college, became a stand-up comic in San Francisco. And then I became a playwright. And one of my plays brought me to Hollywood, and then I had a misbegotten 10 years or so writing television shows.
Any shows I would remember?
I can't remember them myself. Now, one of them was called Blossom. I wrote for Blossom for 3 years.
Oh, cool. So your stand-up comic time in San Francisco, I spent a lot of years in San Francisco. Well, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. So yeah. What was the timeline of that when I moved to San Francisco in '73? So would it have been after '73?
Well, yeah, I was a stand-up comic in 1980 in San Francisco.
Very cool.
There were at that time 3 levels of comedians in San Francisco. There were the big stars, the A-list comedians like Dana Carvey. And then the bottom level was the open micers. There were a lot of open mics, and there must have been 50, 75 comedians who would show up at the open mics. The middle level consisted of me. I emceed the open mics.
Oh, well,
I usually got $10, something like that.
Oh,
I was
cool.
A little higher on the rung than the open micers, not up there with Dana Carvey.
Oh, well. So what got you into writing books?
Well, I met Howard Lyman in around 1995, 96. And he was we had a mutual friend. And Howard, for those who don't know, is a 4th generation cattle rancher from Montana, turned animal rights activist vegan. And it was Howard who was on the Oprah Winfrey show back in 96, I think it was, when he told her about how at the time we were chopping up cows and feeding them back to cows.
Ooh.
And Oprah said, "That does it. I'll never have another hamburger." And some lunatic cattle ranchers didn't think she had a right to say that. And so they sued Oprah and Howard. And Howard and Oprah were vindicated in that lawsuit. So anyway, I met Howard, and he and our mutual friend pitched to me the idea of writing a screenplay based on his life. But I couldn't quite figure out what the ending would be, how that would work. So I politely passed on that opportunity, and then they said, "Well, how about a book?" And I said, "Well, I could try a book." And together we wrote the book Mad Cowboy, published by Simon & Schuster in '98.
Got it. And
So
then,
that got me into book writing, and now I have about a dozen
oh,
books that all advocate the plant-based diet.
fantastic. So let's talk about that a little bit. I want to start with your book, Own Your Health, because that one was rather interesting from a variety of perspectives. And I've read a lot of material. My wife's an RN. She's also a nutritionist and stuff like that. I had David Robinson Simon on my show a couple years ago. We talked about his book, Meatonomics, and the things that are relevant there in terms of the economic impact and some of the social impact, et cetera, et cetera. But your book, Own Your Health, goes into some of the personal experience for you and your wife. And then I want to talk a little bit about that, if that's okay. But I also want to talk about some of the stuff later on in the book relative to, like, the political implications, how we deal with these issues. So, you're a vegan. I understand that. I'm a vegan, which is cool. I find that to be a great way for me to eat. How did it come about that you reached that conclusion for yourself?
Well, there was a lot of heart disease in my family, so I resolved to be a vegetarian as a teenager, and I became a vegetarian at the age of 17. When I told an obese aunt and uncle about it, they immediately were thunderstruck by the news and very concerned for my health. And they said, "Where will you get your protein?" So I said, "Well, I'll get my protein from cheese." And so stupidly, that's what I did. For the next 19 years, I ate no animal products except for cheese. No meat, fish, chicken, no eggs, no dairy, except for cheese. But I didn't drink milk, but I had cheese.
Right.
And then in my mid-30s, I started to feel pains around my heart.
Ooh.
And I thought, man, I've got these terrible genes. So many people in my family died of heart disease, and here I am, a vegetarian, and I'm getting pains around my heart. So I thought about it, and I thought, well, I'm not eating meat because of the saturated fat and cholesterol. And what is cheese except saturated fat and cholesterol? Cheese is coagulated liquid meat.
Yep.
So I gave up the cheese, never went to the doctor, never had any pain since. I'm doing fine.
Fantastic.
And that was 30 years ago.
All right. Now, one of the things that you talk about in your book is the fact that physicians, medical schools do not really spend much time teaching nutritional information to, to the students that are in the medical schools.
Right.
Let's dive into that a little bit. I mean, what are we talking about here in terms of volumes of information or type of information?
Well, what we're talking about is a kind of insanity, and it's really reprehensible that medical schools don't teach nutrition. And I've analyzed the reasons for that. One, are they foolish? I don't think so. I don't think people who run medical schools are fools.
Right.
I'm sure they're all highly educated, intelligent people, so that can't be the explanation. Is it that they don't see wellness as being their mission? In other words, is it because they view the role of doctors as taking care of sick people, and they're not in the business of keeping people healthy? They leave that up to the aromatherapy people, maybe, and the meditators and whatever. But that's foolish too, because it turns out that nutritional therapy is a great way to cure sickness. So they're leaving one of their tools out of the toolbox. So that doesn't make sense.
So is
it that they're corrupt? Is it that they feel that, after all, if people are sick and fat, the doctors and drug companies will make more money? It is true that drug companies contribute to medical schools, contribute a lot of the financing of medical schools, and they also cozy up to young doctors and doctors to be in medical schools. But I don't think that corruption is really the reason. I don't think that young doctors and people who run medical schools are trying to keep Americans sick. So I think that the reason is that they're part of the same culture we are. They eat the same foods we eat. 20% of doctors are obese, 40% are overweight, and they simply don't question whether people can ever change their diet. So if you're going to assume that Americans eat what Americans eat, and we're never going to change what we eat, then what's the point of studying nutrition? So I think that's the reason. I think they just are blind to it. They just, as members of our culture, which is the fattest, sickest population ever to walk planet Earth,
right?
They don't question it.
We've seen this develop over, decades, right? But from the research that you've done, is this historic? Is this the way it's always been in the training of medical stuff?
Nutrition has never been something that doctors have studied in America.
Got it.
And it is, it's criminal, really, because nothing will affect your health more than what you eat.
Yeah,
For almost everything.
And there are a number of when I got a book here, I think the China study from Dr. Campbell, right?
Mm-hmm.
T. Colin Campbell, and which was the first one that my wife brought into the house, and I read that and I went, holy mackerel, this is really interesting, because it really talks about the relationship between the foods that one eats and how that impacts the main diseases that we happen to have here, like diabetes and heart disease and, various and sundry other things, cancer. So that was a bit of an eye-opener. So, what is it, it's not as if the information about this type of dietary shift is not out there, right? There's books about it, there's movies, there's lots of information. So why do you think that it is that people don't respond to? What are they afraid of in terms of why aren't they responding?
Why isn't everyone vegan like you and me? Well, again, it's the culture. We have a culture in which meat eating is accepted. It's normal. You and I, as vegans, are the outliers. And so people can get fed advertising every day for pizza and hamburgers and hot dogs and all these unhealthy foods. Everybody considers it normal. And it's really a question of science versus culture. Well, there really is no serious dispute on the science. Everybody, all scientists and researchers know that fruits are healthy and that meat is not healthy.
Right.
There are no, if you look at something like Dr. Esselstyn's heart study, in which he took profoundly sick heart patients who had many heart attacks and other cardiovascular events already. Mm-hmm. And he got them healthy on a low-fat, whole foods, plant-based diet.
Right.
Now, imagine if a colleague of his believed in the paleo diet.
Right.
And imagine if that colleague pitched to the Cleveland Clinic, hey, would you let me do a study with profoundly sick heart patients? I'll feed them sausages and eggs all day long and see how they do. I mean, would the Cleveland Clinic have funded that study?
Yeah, well, I think most of these, I think there's a clear sense and understanding that is a challenge. You mentioned one of the things about how we see things, we're advertised to. And I remember, David Simon talking about when he was on the show, we discussed how these checkoff programs where the government subsidizes not just the farming of animals for purposes of feeding, but also pays for advertisement that they might use to encourage
Yeah.
people to eat more of the foods that they're growing so that they can be economically viable, which is
Yeah.
very interesting. Now, that led me then to, you know, some of the information that's in your second book, which I actually read first, I must admit, which is Food is Climate, because it sort of takes this concept that we're talking about what is a more viable, appropriate diet for the physiology of humans, for the health of humans, and takes it to another level to talk about the ecological and climatological impact of animal farming and the all things associated with that. So how did you come to write this second book?
Well, I had heard about your next guest, Dr. Silas Rao, and I had heard that he had written a paper arguing, and this paper has been peer reviewed and published, arguing that animal agriculture is responsible for at least 87% of greenhouse gases. Now, normally what you hear when you hear animal agriculture even mentioned in the discussion of climate change, because mostly we hear about the burning of fossil fuels.
Right.
But when they mention animal agriculture, they usually use the figure 15%, that animal agriculture is responsible for 15% of greenhouse gases.
Right.
And they get that figure because the FAO had come up with two pronouncements on this. First, the FAO had said that animal agriculture was responsible for 18% of greenhouse gases. Then when they got a lot of flack from their clientele, which is the ranches around the world and people in the animal agriculture business, they lowered that to 14.5%.
And
So if you
could
kind
you
of
just
do a
for
bad
my
job of averaging out 14.5% and 18% and round it off, you might say 15%. So that's why we
Glenn,
often hear the 15%.
quick question for you, for my
Yeah.
for the viewers here. Could you define FAO? That's an
The
acronym that
Food
I'm
and
not sure everybody
Agriculture
knows.
Organization of the United Nations.
Oh, okay. Farming Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Thank you.
And after the FAO came up with their paper, World Watch did a paper saying that animal agriculture was actually 51%, at least 51% of greenhouse gases. So that meant it's half the ballgame, at least.
Yeah.
And then I heard about Silas's paper, 87%, at least 87%. And that means it's almost the whole ballgame. So how could that be?
So
Well,
we're going to talk to him in a few minutes at the next show. By the way, before we go on, I want to remind our viewers that if there are any questions for me, for Glenn, about his books, you've seen his website put up there. You can send inquiries to info@referencepointtv.com, and we'll certainly get the information to you. One of the interesting things in the book that you mentioned, and I know we want to talk about this more when we get Dr. Rao on with us in the next show, but is this concept of the burning machine versus the killing machine, which is a real interesting phrase, turn of phrase there. Could you define that for our viewers?
Yes, that's Silas's turn of phrase. And by the burning machine, he means what we normally talk about, fossil fuels. We burn gas to run our cars. We burn coal to generate electricity and so forth. The burning of fossil fuels,
right?
Which is almost everything that Al Gore and the leading spokesman on climate change like to talk about, the burning of fossil fuels.
Right.
The killing machine is the destruction of life. It's the killing of animals for food. It's the destruction of the forests in order to create grazing land.
Mm-hmm.
So deforestation and the killing of animals is what we mean by the killing machine. And it is the most pernicious industry on earth. It is the reason the Amazon is currently being destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that it goes back thousands of years, and it's the reason we have a Sahara Desert, because the Sahara Desert was forest and savanna until 10,000 years ago. Now,
Right.
for tens of millions of years, it was forested. So why did it go to desert just 10,000 years ago? Now, there's a generally accepted theory that has to do with a wobble in the Earth's axis, but we know that that wobble was at least exacerbated by human activities, cutting down trees, grazing goats and other animals.
Mm-hmm.
So if we created the Sahara Desert and the other deserts of the Middle East, you can see on the cover of my book, this is a NASA satellite map.
Right.
And red is all pasture maintenance fires.
Mm-hmm.
So when we set these fires and we degrade the land, and you'll see how there's a tremendous stretch of desert from the Sahara across to the deserts of the Middle East, the Thar Desert in northern India, the Gobi Desert, 6,000 miles of mostly desert. Humans did that. And do we want to live in a world in which 50 years from now we're talking about the Amazonian desert? Because if we create too many deserts in order to eat hamburger, we will not survive as a species.
Right.
So this is the most pernicious industry in human history, and it has to stop.
The other area that you mentioned in your book had to do with the impact on the oceans. And we've probably got about 6 minutes or so left in our show before we bring Dr. Rao in. So talk to me a little bit about the health of the oceans and how that impacts things.
Well, the oceans are very sick. They're dying. And industrial fishing is extracting all life from the sea. I recommend that people see the movie Seaspiracy, where I learned, for example, that when the industrial fishing operations put in these mile-long nets into the ocean and they trap dolphins, apparently people don't eat dolphins. So you might think, well, then they would just throw the dolphins back in the water, but they don't. What they do is they kill them and then throw them in the water. Now, why do they do that? If we're not going to eat the dolphins, use the dolphins in any way, why do they kill them? And the reason is they kill them because the dolphins are competing with us for the tuna. So that gives you just an idea of how depraved and cruel an industry this is.
Got it.
It is responsible for kicking up an untold amount of sediment from the bottom of the oceans. Now, when Silas Rao came up with his 87%, there were factors that he couldn't include. He couldn't include, for example, the amount of sediment that industrial fishing is kicking up from the bottom of the ocean. He couldn't include, because we don't have figures on this, how much the phytoplankton population has been destroyed by industrial fishing.
Right.
And the phytoplankton are, of course, sequestering carbon dioxide and generating oxygen.
Right, right.
So he couldn't include that. He couldn't include the greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere from pasture maintenance fires all over the world, because nobody's measuring that.
Right.
And he chose not to include animal respiration from 25 billion farmed animals in the world.
Yeah.
So when you include all that and you add it to Silas's proven demonstrated numbers of 87%, you realize that animal agriculture far, far, far outweighs the burning of fossil fuels as the cause of climate change.
So if one is has a focus on, or a passion for, or is looking to create a change in this area of on climate, the focus of attention on fossil fuels is not going to provide the leverage that you're looking for. From what you just discussed, it's more from higher than 81%. It's likely to be 85, 90%. So if you're spending all of your energy, effort, time, and political capital on a 10% solution, versus energy,
Right.
time, money, and political capital on the 90% of the problem, it would seem to me that you're not necessarily going to generate the results that you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, just think about it logically. Solar panels, for example. I've got nothing against solar panels. I once had them on my house in California. But all solar panels do is they generate clean energy,
Right.
right? So we don't have to burn fossil fuels on a daily basis to create the energy. It comes from the sun. We do, however, have to burn some fossil fuels in the creation
Right.
of those solar panels. So they're not cost free from an environmental standpoint. But let's assume that they're mostly to the good. So they are reducing slightly our need to burn fossil fuels in order to do the job that energy does for us.
Right.
Okay. Now let's compare that to not eating hamburger. Well, if we don't eat hamburger, then we stop deforesting.
Right.
That leaves the trees and the other vegetation to sequester, draw down carbon dioxide. Solar panels don't draw down carbon dioxide.
That's true.
So now we're drawing it down. And at the same time, we're not having the cows on the land. Well, what do the cows do on the land? They graze the land into desert.
Right.
They eat feed that's being grown for them and transported to them. And they belch methane, which is 120 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. So when you give up animal agriculture and you replace it with natural vegetation and trees, you gain in so many ways, you almost can't count how many ways you gain. But when you put up a solar panel, you have some cost in the creation of that solar panel, and your only gain is that you're not burning some coal.
Yeah, you're very minor change. Exactly.
Very
So,
minor.
so we've reached the time when we have to finish up here on this part of our conversation. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have appreciated what we've been hearing from Glen. And he's going to be with us as we follow on to this next conversation with Dr. Rao. But so again, if you have any questions, send those queries into info@referencepointtv.com. Glen, I appreciate your being here. Thank you also for sticking around for the next show. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you next time on Reference Point.